Hello and welcome to another sped up version of a Stampscapes live scene. This is going to be the largest scene that I've done in a live broadcast before. This one's almost a full page at 7.5 by 10 inches. I cut off an inch off both sides so I can mat the piece when complete. Alright, so I'm building on a composition that I did in an earlier live broadcast, and that's using the waterfalls set in the spirit of tide pools, okay? And I really wanted to expand on that. I wanted to create kind of a larger area so that I can represent some of the foreground here as being underwater, and I wanted to build off, or build up, I should say, the background behind the waterfalls here. Not really supposed to be waterfalls, but just kind of this tidal zone, okay? So I just stamped out that seaside cove, and I stamped it on a little bit of a ledge like that, so I had to kind of restamp that area in there. And I'm going in here with some additional boulders to represent the rocks going kind of a little bit farther out to sea in this tidal zone. And what I'm mentioning to the live audience is I'm just using an increasingly smaller area of the stamp to represent the rocks that are farther off in the distance. All right, using a couple of the islands to represent, you know, kind of some background land formations, and that's one of those things that occurred to me after my first scene. I thought, oh, I should have used those islands in the background. Okay, now I'm going to create an area right in the middle of these clouds to represent some light, or an area of light to reflect down on the water below. Okay. All right, that's our composition, all monochromatic, done in with just a black ink pad. Sometimes going for lighter impressions, though, going for the second impression to create these underwater rocks in this foreground tidal area. Okay, now this is something that I was talking about to my live audience, and that's the use of re-inkers on your applicator. In this case, it's just a wadded up piece of paper towel. Kind of gives you the spirit of doing some finger painting, okay? And adding a lot of that ink onto that paper towel like that really gives us a lot of ink to utilize and to apply to our paper, especially in something this size, okay? If you have a lot of ink, it just makes the process so much easier and smoother to lay down. Okay, now one of the things that I'm going to be doing in here is I'm not only coloring, but I'm retaining some lighter areas, and that's going to represent the light reflecting off of the background ocean. Some areas on the rocks are going to be lighter, like they're reflecting that light, and in that pool in the foreground, it represents the light kind of illuminating the surface of that area. Okay, kind of darkening some of the perimeter here. All right, this is a very light value. I'm going in here with the Memento Summer Sky. It's a really light value of blue, and it's usually a pretty good idea to go in with a light value because it's not a big commitment to whatever hue you're using when you use a light value of any given hue. And what I mean by hue is just blue tones, okay? All right, now one of the things that you do, if you're doing this kind of layered dye-based ink style of coloring, okay, it's like going and glazing your scene to try to achieve a nice deep saturated look, okay, is with this first base layer, one of the things that people do not do, because they're not used to it, okay, what they do is they color the surface. But what I did there is I went back over it again with some additional ink to not only color something and get my lighting down, but I really want to kind of saturate the surface and the pulp of the paper with that liquid, okay? Now, as I'm doing this on this scene, it might dry out on me if it was a really arid, you know, summer day. So you might have to go over it again with those lighter tones again, just kind of give the whole piece a good slathering. In this case, I didn't need to. but you might have to do that at times to get the darker inks that you apply later to blend easier. Okay, so kind of applying a wet ink into a slightly damp surface is going to be the thing that makes the process really easy and gradual for you, and that's one of the key things. You want these inks to apply nice and gradually, not like some kind of like instantaneous watercolor or, I don't know, kind of a calligraphic type of application, you know, where, you know, once you hit the brush to the paper, that is it, okay? You want it to where you're kind of adding inks on a not slick surface or anything sopping wet or anything like that, but just a little bit damp, which allows you to really spread your inks in a nice, graceful manner, okay? And that's all about that first, you know, 1 or 2 colors that you add down there, okay? I don't always do things that way. In like my Stampscapes 2 class, I do have people just do an entirely monochromatic piece where you're going in kind of with the opposite spirit. You know, you're just using black ink to achieve all the gray tones, okay? And you're not switching up, you know, from one very light tone to the next. But in this case, that's what we're doing, okay? And that makes the process really, really, it's user-friendly. It takes a little bit more time, but you don't lose the benefit of those base layers because these are transparent colors, so that if you add something that's darker over something lighter, that light color is still influencing what you can see, because the darker colors that you add over the lighter ones are see-through, so it's like a nice, deep, glazed, rich surface, okay? All right, now you can see clearly I'm retaining some areas of light. You know, the darker I get, the lighter those light areas are going to seem by contrast, okay? So as I move through my darker tones, one of the things that is really important is to keep track of your lighter areas and try to not eradicate those, okay? So I've been teaching people how to do this for a long time. I used to teach live classes, and, you know, going to conventions, we used to do, you know, thousands of make and takes, okay? Now, one of the things that occurred to me at one point in time, which I always kind of reminded people of in the live situations, is those areas of light that you've established with your first few colors, in this case it's about 3 colors or so, it's important to retain those areas because it's easy to eradicate them when you get into your darker tones, okay? All right, so I'm going on with a Marvy number 10 light blue here, and you can see it's just a slight value change from the previous color. I was showing people the benefit of Marvy inks. They're just so much brighter than a lot of other inks. Not that you should only use Marvies, okay? I like using Marvies in conjunction with Mementos, Distress inks. I guess those are pretty much the 2 that I use, you know, in the form of other dye-based inks. But the Marvy ones can really brighten things up, okay? Now, if you don't have Marvy inks and you want to retain a nice, bright, rich surface, after you're done with your scene, spray seal it with like a Krylon acrylic spray, you know, like a UV-resistant clear or something of that sort, okay? Okay, now see, as I'm going in here with this darker tone, it's kind of more of a medium tone blue. I might be tapping it around in that area that's kind of lighter, but I'm doing it with a very dry application, so it's a very light version of that blue, okay? People always get this to this point in time, but sometimes when they hit it with, you know, the darker blues or black, they get this big, huge slathering of black, where it's just like solid black with no kind of transition through the grays, okay? And that's one thing I really emphasize in my workshops and stuff. When you get to the darkest tones, your page is going to be fairly moist, okay? So when it's really moist like that, the slower the transferal, is that the word? Transferal of the transfer of ink from your applicator to the page, okay? So in other words, when I'm tapping my darker tones, it's not transferring onto the page so much because the page is starting to get super saturated with moisture, you know, of the previously applied dye-based inks, okay? So just be aware of that. I mean, it's going to be different, you know, depending on where you are. If you're in... I always have to mention this, apparently. Like, if I'm in Arizona, okay? It's because I was there demonstrating. It's like, oh my god, my inks are like drying up like instantly, even on a quarter-page card, as I'm working on it. So the kind of the mechanics of adding inks in a very dry climate is much different than, you know, kind of a more humid climate, okay? So just be aware of that, okay? Okay, but see that, you know, see that area? So in my clouds and the distant ocean, in those distant foreground, you know, tide pool rocks, on my waterfalls, and that little area down below, you know, below the waterfalls, actually, there's 2 areas of light in that area. Those are my areas of lightness right there, so I have to try to, remember to, you know, this is, when I'm saying that, I'm always having to remind myself too, okay, here's my areas of light. Don't lose that, okay? Because this is where it's really easy to lose that lighting in there. But this is a fairly dark blue that I'm adding in here, but it's going on there pretty gradually because, like I said, the page is fairly moist, and I'm not, you know, it's not transferring to the surface very quickly, okay? Sometimes I want it to transfer a little bit faster, but, you know, that being said, it's also the thing that's allowing for a very smooth and varied application of the ink. You know what I mean? It's just, it's blending in perfectly. I can really use very poor technique and smash that color into the surface, but the surface and pulp of the paper is fairly wet, so I can spread it around if need be. So I can use like the worst possible technique to do my application of ink, but I can spread it around because that page is, you know, pretty well saturated like that. That being said, sometimes if you're trying to apply darker inks and it's just not going on for you because it's just too moist, just allow your page to set up for, you know, 5 minutes or something like that, and then go back to it and then add some more inks in there, you know. Go and grab a drink or something like that, or take a break and just allow it to set up for a little bit. Okay, so this is where I'm going in and adding, I think that's black. Yeah, that's black right there, okay? But see that? So I smashed it in there, and I can spread it around like that. So I was just showing people, you know, the benefits of using that re-inker to begin with, okay? And see, I was showing people like that. I applied some black ink down, and I just kind of wiped it off, you know, because it's kind of, at this point in time, it's kind of like floating ink that you're adding down there, okay? All right, now this is, like I said, it's a full page scene, so I don't know, it's really taking, you know, a decent amount of time because it's like working 4 standard size, you know, cards. And I'm using quite a bit of ink here. I really wanted this surface to look nice and deep and rich in terms of those blues, you know, because it is, you know, it's monochromatic here for the most part. I do have some warmer blues and kind of some cooler blues in there. But, you know, definitely a monochromatic piece. So, since I'm working with a limited color palette or color scheme, I really want those colors to be nice and rich from a value perspective, light and dark. And I also want it to be a good intensity range from dull to very bright, okay? All right, so I'm just showing people how to add in their dark, kind of strong vignette applications here. Okay. But going back to those large scenes, I don't know, I guess I feel like torturing people or something like that in these live broadcasts. This one was like a 3-hour scene. Quite a bit. And again, it's one of these scenes that I just, you know, this tide pool type of scene I just haven't done before. So it's me kind of figuring out a lot of, I don't know, different types of, oh, I don't know, coloring types of issues and considerations. See, I wanted this to look like we were kind of seeing a split screen type of thing where we can see above water, and then this area below the waterfalls would be like the tidal zone. So it's like we are seeing areas or objects under that water, okay? More so than, like we're above water. I wanted to, make it look like we were, I don't know, like sitting in the water itself, like I don't know, maybe like a diver or something like that. Okay, now I've added these twisting leaves in here. I always thought they can look like kelp, and they have that kind of S-curve formation to it, reminiscent of something kind of floating in the water. But now those didn't stamp out tremendously dark, which I kind of wanted. But then it occurred to me, we could use some stronger foreground impressions of those leaves. In this case, they represent kelp. So I decided later on to go with the VersaFine Clair and to emboss some additional elements in here. And you'll see also when I add in the light beams into the piece. Okay, we're going in with the salmon here. I don't think I've stamped so many salmon in any scene before. They're not supposed to represent salmon, but I don't know, just little school of something kind of, swimming around in the shallows. They're a little bit too dark in here, but again, I just utilize white pigment ink and the light beams going over them. So I'm not really worried about that. Okay, going into my rocks here, you can get much more detailed with some markers, with whatever markers you want. I happen to be using alcohol markers here. Kind of working on some of my shadows. I'm not going in with a tremendously dark gray tone here. I mean, you could probably barely tell what I'm doing right here, but it's kind of just a subtle application of tone. And I start off light, and then I'll work darker. It's kind of picking up some of that black that's on there, even though they are different binders, with the dye-based inks being water-based and the alcohol being alcohol. Sometimes if you have some moist ink on the surface still, it can pick that up. All right, going in with this little bit of a brighter blue in here, kind of working my shadows. It's going on a little bit too harsh, but as always, one of the beautiful things about alcohol inks on certain types of surfaces, such as this glossy cardstock, you can just blend it right in. So I'm going in with some kind of harsh applications of my inks in here. And what I do is I just blend it out using a lighter version of that ink, or you can use your blender pen if you want to. Now, for these rocks in here, I thought I would address, I don't know, going for a little bit of a change of hue. So I'm adding in this little green in here, represents maybe some seaweed or something like that on the rocks in this tidal zone. And it's a little bit too much of a bright green, so I'm just going in and blending it out right here. But see, it kind of gives it a little bit of a hue and temperature change from the surrounding area. Sometimes it's a little bit too harsh, but again, what I do is I just go back in and I address some areas with some white pigment ink, okay? So anything that I don't get how I, would ideally want it in the end result, I just see it as kind of an intermediate process in here. I still have some other things that I'm going to do in there, so I don't really worry about it at all. And that's one of the things I'd like to always emphasize when I'm doing these scenes with either on a live broadcast or just pre-recorded. I always tell people, these scenes do not look like these finished pieces, when you're just doing the composition. And then when you do some coloring, it doesn't necessarily, areas aren't necessarily going to look like that if you add in some additional touches after this, okay? So I always recommend you just keep, working your scenes and blending it in. And when you do those final touches, that's when it all usually comes together. If you do all these things, there's much, much more simple applications of the imagery where you might be working it through 3 steps, okay? But on something like this, where it's kind of coming together nice and gradually, methodically, etc., just kind of work it to the end and trust that the kind of process and finishing touches will bring it all together. Okay, going on with some additional tones. I'm kind of creating a little bit more of a stronger vignette here. Okay, this is where all these additional textures start, and I'm going in here with some white pigment ink, okay? Now watch, every time I start applying this white pigment ink, I'm always starting it in the lighter area, applying a decent little amount of it. It's not a big slathering of it. It's kind of a dry brush application of it, meaning you have to take off a lot of ink off of your, in this case, cotton ball before you start applying it. You want to think about it like you're applying like a light powder onto your scene. It's liquid, but the spirit of it is like you're doing like a little powdery type of very dry application of it, okay? Not like you're applying some kind of like cold pack cream to, like makeup or something like that. I always try to make the analogy like you're applying like a foundation or something like that, Yeah, it's a liquid ink, but the spirit of it is where you're just kind of building up a little bit more as needed, as opposed to going in with a thick slathering of it. So be careful about that, because pigment inks are very thick and, are practically like, I don't know, like paint. Sometimes I kind of mistakenly refer to them as paint because that's the way I kind of see them. So with certain types of painting techniques, we call it dry brushing. In this case, maybe it's dry, I don't know, cotton balling or something like that, into the scene, okay? See those distant islands in the background, how I've applied a thin layer of pigment ink onto, the left side, right side of it. And that makes it look like those islands are being illuminated by that break in the clouds, the lighting coming from above, okay? Putting a little bit of fog at the base of the lighthouse there. Okay. Looks like my camera overexposed for some reason right there. Okay, now I've applied it down in my water because I wanted to create kind of this churning kind of water. Okay, illuminating my lighthouse light right there. See, I didn't have to keep it nice and light in there. I just, illuminated my piece. I used a little bit too much of that white acrylic pen right there. Those colors really stand out too much, so I just kind of wipe them out a little bit. I subdue them. And this is really fun right here. This is going back to kindergarten with some splatter painting. Some Dr. Martin's Bleed Proof White, opaque white watercolor paint on a toothbrush, and just going in and applying that splatter type of texture to the base of those, waterfalls. Applying some splattering behind the waterfalls. Maybe they're not supposed to be waterfalls. They're supposed to be this just tidal zone, when the water comes in, it's coming over the rocks like that. So applying some of that splattering behind that area and kind of giving a little bit of a textural continuity between the area in the back and the front. Doesn't it give it, the whole piece, like a lot of motion? If you haven't seen me use this splatter painting technique, I often use it at the in the base of waterfalls like this, but I also use it in favorite applications are for snowfall or some stars in the sky. Okay, this is going in with a acrylic white paint pen. Okay, extra fine tip. And I'm just showing people I'm doing those little striations on the water surface. Right here I'm adding in some highlights on my clouds. Kind of bringing those to life a little bit. Okay, giving my light a little bit of a, kind of a soft glow, like it's, in some sea mist air or something like that. On some of these, I'm making some of these little splashes kind of glow a little bit. It kind of brings in this kind of little mystical looking element into some of those, just from a textural standpoint. You can make stars glow or something like that too. Okay, so I'm adding in these light beams under the water. It's like if you're underwater, you know, there's so much sediment in the water suspended, you know, and having that light kind of come into that really changes the spirit of that underwater area. Going in with some additional twisting leaves, and we're going to emboss them here. Some extra fine or detailed clear embossing powder. It makes these foreground elements a little bit lighter, I think because the clear kind of mixes with that black ink, but oh well, it's kind of fun having them raised. Okay, formatting like this, and then we have our practically full page scene. And it makes for some fun stuff. I do a few little finishing touches on here. Going in here with some additional little pigment ink applications with a Q-tip instead of a cotton ball this time. You know, going in these little kind of harder to reach areas. A little bit of that mist coming over the top of that rock right there. Lightening up some of these seagulls, so it looks like some of these gulls are farther back in the distance than the darker ones like that. Little things like that are really fun to do and kind of make for some good finishing touches. But that is my full-size piece, and if you watch the full-length one, you should get a medal. But just doing this faster version for those that don't have, you know, 1,000 hours to watch through the live one. Okay, so anyways, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it.